Have you ever thought about what life would be like in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus? Know that there were disreputable establishments disguised as inns along the sacred paths, and a peculiar nuptial market, where dowries were agreed, taking into account the women's physical structure. Explore the mysteries of a sacred city that kept secrets beyond biblical accounts, where the opulent golden temple dimmed the view of those who gazed upon it under the intense sun, and life expectancy barely exceeded 30 years. Immerse yourself in the contrasts of a Jerusalem that, despite being a place of devotion, was also the scene of a coexistence between wealth and poverty. The city's air was filled with the smells of rare incense and exotic spices, and the shimmering gold temple dazzled onlookers with its dazzling brilliance. This was a Jerusalem of extremes, with a vitality that, although intense, was ephemeral for most of its residents. Strategically located on hills and surrounded by 3 deep valleys, Jerusalem did not become the holy city by geographical accident. Its altitude, exceeding 700 meters above sea level, not only offered a natural defense against invaders, but also provided a milder climate compared to the surrounding deserts. When strolling through the narrow streets, suddenly coming across a panoramic view of the region was like approaching the divine. Perhaps that is why it has established itself as a spiritual center for different beliefs. But what really impressed was the sophisticated water system that sustained the city in the middle of the arid Judean desert. While other areas struggled with water shortages, Jerusalem possessed an intricate network of underground tunnels and aqueducts that captured water from distant sources and directed it to enormous cisterns carved into the rock. Hezekiah's tunnel, more than 500 meters long, is a remarkable example of engineering of the era, excavated from solid rock by workers who started from opposite sides and met at the midpoint, a remarkable feat without modern measuring technology. In the center of the city, Herod's temple stood as a symbol of magnificence. Its construction was so impressive that even travelers accustomed to the grandeur of Rome were astonished. Large blocks of limestone, weighing more than 100 tons, were erected and fitted together with such precision that not even a thin blade could penetrate between the stones. Covered in gold, the temple reflected sunlight so intensely that looking directly at it at dawn could cause temporary blindness, a fact confirmed by Jewish texts of the time. Life expectancy in Jerusalem in those times did not exceed 30 years for most. Epidemics were common, especially during large religious celebrations when the city filled with pilgrims and the population tripled. Diseases such as gastrointestinal infections, which are now easily treatable, could be fatal. Interestingly, people living in rural areas lived on average 5 years longer, suggesting that the stress of city life was already harmful at that time. The Jerusalem market was a true cultural mosaic, where spices such as cinnamon from Arabia, pepper from India, and incense from Yemen could be found. These items were not just condiments, but represented status and power. Small amounts of saffron had a value equivalent to a month's salary for a common worker. The trade in these commodities was so profitable that many of the temple merchants, those whom Jesus rebuked, had left the exchange of coins to devote themselves to this more advantageous business. Historical records indicate that although most people wore simple, undyed clothes, wealthy women had a passion for garments imported from India and China, fabrics so delicate and translucent that they caused scandal among the most rigid religious leaders. Such clothing was subject to severe criticism from conservatives at the time. Fashions considered decadent and immoral did not prevent the wives of wealthy priests and merchants from flaunting them in private meetings. If this content is piquing your curiosity about everyday life in biblical times, leave a like and subscribe to signal your interest in uncovering more secrets from the past. Have you ever reflected on what people consumed at the beginning of the day in Jesus' time? In ancient Jerusalem, the day began before sunrise with a rather modest morning meal, barley bread, olives, and some goat cheese. This bread was very different from what we know today, being hard and often containing small stones from the grinding process, which wore down teeth prematurely. For most of the population, meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, perhaps enjoyed once or twice a month, usually after sacrifices made in the temple. Fermented drinks were consumed on a large scale, not for pleasure, but out of necessity, due to the frequent contamination of the water in the cisterns. Wine, always diluted in a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine, was drunk by everyone, including children, to purify the water and add extra calories. Posca, a popular drink among workers, consisted of a mixture of wine, vinegar, herbs and water, and was also offered to Jesus on the cross. Sleeping arrangements in Jerusalem at that time reveal surprising aspects of family life. In the simplest houses, everyone slept together in a single room, lying on mats on the floor. In winter, when the nights were cold due to the city's altitude, animals such as goats and chickens were brought indoors as their body heat helped to warm the space. Small depressions in the floors of houses were used to place covered embers, which released heat during the night. Beauty rituals included practices now seen as repugnant, such as using urine to whiten teeth and bleach white clothes. Expensive perfumes included exotic ingredients such as musk extracted from animals and ambergris, a whale intestinal secretion occasionally found on Mediterranean beaches. Surprisingly, dried and ground dove dung was used in face masks, believed to lighten skin blemishes. The economy of ancient Jerusalem showed a great social abyss. A common worker received about a denarius a day, enough to buy approximately 12 small loaves of bread. Meanwhile, a simple tunic cost 4 denarii, and a better quality toga could be equivalent to an entire month's salary. In contrast to this, low-income families spent more than 70% of their earnings on basic food, while rich priests and merchants allocated only 5% of their income on food, but of higher quality. Superstitions permeated the daily lives of the inhabitants. Amulets against the evil eye were universal, used from children to the elderly, regardless of social class. Even educated priests carried parchments containing excerpts from the Torah in leather pouches strapped to their arms or under their robes. It was believed that certain illnesses were caused by demons that entered the body during sleep, justifying the custom of sleeping with the head covered. Envy was considered a source of bad luck, and mothers avoided wiping the faces of pretty babies when going out into the streets to protect them. As for feminine hygiene practices, women used linen or wool cloths to deal with menstruation, which were washed and reused. According to Jewish law, they were supposed to retreat to a separate space in the house during this period, which, although oppressive in modern terms, was sometimes seen as a respite from arduous household chores. For the wealthier women, there were luxurious cushions made from soft fibers imported from Egypt, an unimaginable privilege for most. For ordinary women and children in Jerusalem, toys were few and simple, often including small ceramic figurines of animals or people. The more fortunate could have fun with cloth dolls or carved wooden artifacts. Among adults, games of chance were extremely popular, most notably a dice game made from animal bones known as astragalus. Roman soldiers were notorious for betting their rations and even their weapons in these games, which helps to understand the gospel passage where soldiers draw lots for Jesus' tunic. The most profitable professions in Jerusalem were not always the most respected. Spice traders and money changers could amass considerable fortunes, but they were viewed with suspicion. In contrast, scribes, although generally not wealthy, enjoyed enormous social prestige. Among the most stigmatized occupations were leather tanners, who dealt with animal corpses and smelly substances such as urine and excrement. The stigma was so strong that these professionals lived segregated in specific parts of the city, usually near the Valley of Hinnom, and were rarely able to marry outside their own communities. Medical practice in Jerusalem combined superstition, religious rituals, and surprisingly effective practical knowledge. Wounds were treated with wine as an antiseptic and covered with a mixture of olive oil and herbs. For fevers, a combination of pomegranate juice and honey was used. Interestingly, some treatments seen as absurd, such as applying bread mold to wounds, foreshadowed antibiotics and were scientifically proven centuries later. Prepare to discover how the festivities radically altered the city's atmosphere, with music echoing off the temple walls and competitions that would challenge even modern-day Olympians. If this detailed look at everyday life in the time of Jesus is fascinating you, leave a like as a gesture of interest, and in the comments write, "I want more," and we will lead you to new revelations. Although it is thought that a holy city like Jerusalem was an example of purity and devotion, the reality of Jesus' time was much more complex. Behind the temple's stone facades and aura of sanctity, there was an underworld of forbidden pleasures and behaviors often omitted by religious texts. On pilgrimage routes, inns with ulterior motives proliferated, offering not only rest, but also companionship for lonely travelers. Disguised as legitimate establishments, these places catered to pilgrims, merchants, and sometimes even priests in search of clandestine pleasures. Roman authorities, pragmatic in their approach, not only tolerated but often taxed these activities, turning the vice into a source of revenue for the empire. An intriguing aspect of Jerusalemite society was the so-called wife market, which was not literally a market, but a system of marriage negotiations where dowries were discussed between men and brides' families, especially in the vicinity of the temple, on Saturdays after prayers. The value of a bride depended not only on her beauty, but also on her robustness, health, and most importantly, her presumed fertility. Women with wider hips received larger dowries, as they promised easier births and a greater ability to bear offspring. Documents from the time reveal marriage contracts with specific clauses about the partial return of the dowry if the wife did not conceive within 2 years. Although officially prescribed, fertility rituals of Canaanite and Phoenician origin persisted in the rural areas around Jerusalem. On full moon nights, especially in spring, women who had difficulty getting pregnant went to secret sanctuaries in the caves of nearby valleys. There, rituals that mixed pagan practices with Jewish prayers were performed under the direction of unofficial priestesses, often widows or older women, who preserved ancient knowledge about herbs and potions. Penalties for crimes in Jerusalem ranged from corporal punishment to death, depending on the severity of the offense and the social status of the offender. The city was a tangle of laws, both Jewish and Roman, and justice could be harsh and unforgiving. Despite this, daily life continued with its peculiarities, reflecting a society rich in contrasts and nuances, far beyond purely devout narratives. While the Roman code tended to impose fines for minor offenses and crucifixion for the most serious, Jewish law was notable for its severe penalties, such as mutilation for repeat thieves and stoning for adulterers, although in practice the latter was rarely carried out. A particularly terrifying punishment was drowning in the pool of Siloam for those who desecrated sacred temple objects, seen as a death that would prevent the purification of the soul in the afterlife. In Jerusalem at the time, contraceptive and abortive methods were used secretly by women. Herbs such as aruda and silphium, a plant now extinct, were cultivated in domestic gardens under the guise of spices, but their true use was known among women, passed down from generation to generation. Ancient medical documents reference pessaries made from plant fibers and fermented honey and vinegar drinks used to prevent pregnancy. These practices, although prohibited by religious laws, were common even among the wives of devout men. Murders by poisoning were almost impossible to detect, with poisons extracted from plants such as mandrake and aconite, dissolved in wine sweetened with honey to mask their bitter flavors. The Herodian family was especially known for resorting to this method to eliminate political opponents. Herod the Great feared being poisoned and forced his servants to taste his food and drink, a practice that spread among the city's elite. Periods of religious festivals, when Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims, were the ideal time for thieves, with organized groups taking advantage of the crowd for their actions. The scandal that most shocked the residents of Jerusalem was the incest practiced openly in the Herodian dynasty. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee in Jesus' time, married Herodias, who was both his niece and his half-brother's ex-wife. This relationship, which was publicly condemned by John the Baptist, cost him his life, and was just one example of the moral decadence that the population associated with the ruling family. You've just uncovered some of the best-kept secrets of Jerusalem in Jesus' time, but your exploration of the ancient world is far from over. Share so that more people know this story. See you in the next video.